Welcome to what is now the last lecture in the Modern Critical Theory lecture series. Before we begin, I would like to thank the instructors and students of the affiliated seminars for their lively engagement in the lecture series, both in the Q&A sessions and in seminar discussions. Thanks also to many other faculty and students who join these conversations and take time out of very busy schedules to be here for these late evening gatherings. If the Modern Critical Theory lecture series has become an important part of campus life, developing interdisciplinary connections and seeding new research trajectories, it is entirely because of the robust commitment that you all bring to reimagining the place of theory in the present. It's a great pleasure to introduce Andrew Leong, who will be giving today's lecture on queer theory, which is titled The Future of Queer Theory, the Usure of Modernist Form. Andrew Leong is Assistant Professor in the Department of English and Asian Languages and Cultures at Northwestern University. He's also a faculty affiliate of the program in Critical Theory and the Asian American Studies program. He teaches courses on Japanese and American literature of the long 20th century, Asian American literature, modernist literature in Asia, manga and graphic novels, and Westerns and Japanese period drama. His research focuses on the literature of Japanese colonial and immigrant diasporas in the Americas, as well as queer and critical theoretical approaches to the study of literary genre, gendered embodiment, and generational time. In 2014, Leong received an Outstanding Book Award from the Association for Asian American Studies for his translations in Lament in the Night, a critical edition that collects the two extant novels of Nagahara Shoshin, an author who wrote for a Japanese reading public in the mid-1920s Los Angeles. Leong is currently completing a book manuscript entitled The Origins of Japanese American Literature Are Queer and Mixed. This book examines Japanese and English language texts written by Shoshin, Sadakichi Hartman, Yone Noguchi, and Arashima Takeo, authors who resided in the United States between the opening of mass emigration in 1885 and the immigration ban imposed by the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924. Leong's recent articles have been published in Verge and Post-45 Contemporaries. Please welcome Andrew Leong.
Thank you. I'll begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking on the traditional lands of the Illinois, and this acknowledgement is important in and of itself. It's also important given that the topic I'm speaking about today, that is the future of queer theory, is one where, as practitioners of any theory of futures, we must never forget the erasures that occur when one figures or mythologizes the future as blank space, white space, new horizons, new frontiers, or whole new worlds. I also thank Susan for her kind introduction and invitation, Alyssa Brauer for coordinating travel arrangements, the unit, and all of you for coming at this late hour to this, the last of this fall semester's lectures on modern critical theory. Since this is the last lecture of the fall, I felt some obligation to provide a culminating experience, a lecture that permits you to take a backward glance over the road that you have traveled thus far. My backward-looking, retrospective attitude may seem odd for a talk whose title would seem to promise the future of queer theory. Perhaps it is better to say from the outset that I'm speaking less in prophetic terms about what I think the future of queer theory will be or should be, but more in retrospective terms about what the futures of queer theory have been. Both my desire to provide a culminating experience and my retrospective orientation have informed my choice of readings. Lee Edelman's No Future, published 2004, and Jose Esteban Munoz's Cruising Utopia, 2009, are not the most recent works of queer theory, and in the years since the Great Recession of 2000 to 2009, many timely, exciting works have been published, works whose urgency might lend themselves better to an account of the future of queer theory as one might imagine it in our present moment in 2017. Nevertheless, turning to the pairing of Edelman and Munoz in the context of this forum, the last lecture of the fall, might provide you a moment where you can see or hopefully start to gather a consolidation or convergence of several of the theoretical currents you have encountered thus far. So I've kind of tried to map this out with this chalk diagram here. And from the readings that I've suggested you to do, if we divide them between a category of Munoz, thinking about queer futurity, and Edelman, thinking in terms of a no future, we can see a kind of broad, very broad strokes divide between Munoz, who's working, broadly speaking, in a German idealist tradition, drawn from most immediately Bloch and Marcuse of the Frankfurt School, Heidegger through Husserl, and back through Marx up to Hegel, Kant of German idealism. And in Edelman, the primary reference are, say, Lacan and de Man, both of whom are working from a kind of Saussurean understanding of structural linguistics that place them within this kind of tradition. So hopefully this can help situate Edelman and Munoz as a kind of culmination or convergence of lectures that you've heard thus far in the series. I should note here that as someone trained in comparative literature and not in philosophy, political economy, or history, I tend towards thinking in terms of Weltliteratur or world literature, a term used by both Goethe and Marx, and I gravitate towards thinking about modes of contact, translation, and exchange between languages and nations, or in the case of Edelman and Munoz, translations between theoretical idioms that also set these idioms within larger historical contexts and wider geographical relations. So I guess one of the concerns that I have is how does one reconcile Munoz with Edelman? How does one think about a way to translate between the two quite distinct theoretical frameworks that they offer or are working through, all under the rubric of an overarching umbrella of something called queer theory? If I am making a claim about the future of queer theory, it's probably in the vein of wanting to join and invite others to take an affirmative speculative risk of engaging with meta-narratives, that is, long historical and world-spanning narratives. These narratives can be both linear and cyclical. I want, I think, to encourage us to relax the automatic habit, nearly reflexive habit now, of dismissing all forms of historical narrative as somehow tied to liberal Western notions of progress, and thus to be willing to risk thinking queerly across long centuries of temporal scale and world scales of space. So to get us there, I'm going to start with a small key. In my search for a kind of translator cipher or clef, or a mediating figure between Edelman and Munoz, I will look outside their work and borrow from the exurg as opening section of Derrida's 1971 White Mythology, or Metaphor in the Text of Philosophy. Let's see. So as Derrida translator Alan Bass notes, the word exurg derives from the Greek exergon, literally outside the work. This somewhat responds to the idea that Derrida says there's no outside the text or the work. In French and English, it has a specifically numismatic sense, referring to the space on a coin or a metal reserved for an inscription. And in French, it also has the sense of an epigraph, or something outside the work. So in the exurg to White Mythology, Derrida plays upon two meanings of the French word usure. On the one hand, it means usury, as in the acquisition of excessive interest on profit of a loan. On the other hand, it means usage, the wear and tear, the deterioration or whittling down of an object that occurs through use. So why, in English, would one want to look back to usages that might to us seem archaic? Why, in the search for the future of queer theory, might one perversely turn back to an earliest 20th century thinking of modernist form, or turn back even earlier to early modern 16th century understandings of usury as contra naturam, or going against nature? So literary scholars in the audience might think I'm leading up towards a reading of Ezra Pound's modernist poetry on Usure. And the giant vortice's sucking sound that you hear is my decision not to do so. I will turn instead, if I have time, to a reading of one of Pound's predecessors, the poet Yone Noguchi, to telegraph if I have time. Okay, but back to a broader frame of reference. So why, in talking about the future, should one turn back, or ought one turn back to modernist form and Usure? Perhaps Edelman has prompted me to a greater appreciation of Lacanian triangle and tetrahedral diagramming, but I will project my answer to this question, why Usure, through this triangle, and perhaps I ought to call it a pyramid scheme. So I have drawn this broadly to think about the three coordinating terms of my talk, the future, or I guess starting with future and user and kind of figure, to kind of think of about a triangulation through money, language, and thought, through various ways of thinking about the speculative, species or specie in terms of money, general economy through Bataille, general formula of capital through Marx, general linguistics, general course in linguistics through Saussure, and a kind of universalizing tendency or unary tendency with Lacanian or Demanian thinking and deconstruction. So, that's the broad kind of triangular outline of how this goes, and now I'm going to try to exfoliate this triangular structure. So I have drawn the future edge through thought and money based upon a striking passage in Speculate This, a 2013 text written by a collective known as the Uncertain Commons. Quote, "It is in the early 17th century that species derived from the Latin species linked to specere from outward appearance and form comes to signify coin, money, or bullion. For the moment, this is what concerns us. The etymon linking speculation to vision and hence to representation gives rise to a modern ambivalence, namely a structural oscillation and internal chasm between thought and money." The Commons continues. "Speculation has two distinct semantic conceptual registers, cognitive and economic. To speculate may mean to contemplate, to ponder, and hence to form conjectures, to make estimations and projections, to look into the future so as to hypothesize. And it may also mean to buy and sell so as to profit from the future rise and fall of market value, to invest in the hope of profit but with a risk of loss, and hence to engage in business transactions of a risky nature that may yield unusually high returns in the future. The bridge that spans across the two registers of modern speculation and that binds them indissolubly to one another consists of a certain conception of the future. Both intellectual or financial investments project into and stake claims on the future." So when Edelman declares, quote, "the future is kid stuff," I think that we can find within that declaration a felt sense that the future is simple, that is kid stuff, insofar as the futures of market speculation and financial capitalism thoroughly saturate lived experience in the United States of the early 21st century. So I'm not going to dwell on these futures for long, since they suffuse our present. Moving on to the next edge, I think Edelman, via a Lacanian understanding of the symbolic, that is the realm of the speaking subject, or the law of the father, gives us the bottom edge of the scheme. The thought figure language edge is a loose representation of the inevitability or inescapability of figuration. In brief, for Edelman via Lacan, there's no access to anything like a real essence or thought or identity or politics without the mediation of figural logics or linguistic structures. As Edelman writes, "Queerness exposes the obliquity of our relation to what we experience in and as social reality, alerting us to the fantasies structurally necessary in order to sustain it, and engaging those fantasies through the figural logics, the linguistic structures that shape them." This understanding of the figure or figural is crucial to Edelman's clarification that there is nothing essential to the identities of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual, and transgender persons that, quote, "predisposes them to resist the appeal to futurity, to refuse the temptation to reproduce, or to place themselves outside or against the acculturating logic of the symbolic," end quote. For Edelman, there's no ground on which we or anyone could stand outside the figural logics of the symbolic. So accordingly, by arguing that queers might embrace the figural association with the end of the logic of reproductive futurism, Edelman is not for a moment assuming that queers are not themselves also invested in preserving the familial narrativity of reproductive futurism. But politics, construed as oppositional or not, never rests, for Edelman, on essential identities. It centers instead on the figurality that is always essential to identity, and thus on the figure relations in which social identities are always inscribed. Although I am largely on board with Edelman when it comes to thinking through and about figurality, a figure that's particularly helpful for literary scholars that want to reinvest and think about why figures, metaphors, and literary text are important, I'm less willing to follow him in his recourse to Paul de Man's take on the theory of irony, which I think can all too easily slip into hasty dismissals of all forms of history or narrative through a kind of subliminal universalizing tendency. One of the problems with this dismissal of all forms of history or narrative is that by extension, it also removes the possibility of all Marxist or historical materialist modes of dialectical thought, modes of thought that I think that we still need to think with. So for de Man, irony is a particular trope that does not merely undermine narrative as a representational mode that allegorizes tropes in general, but is rather a particular trope that undermines the basis of any and all narration. As quoted by Edelman, de Man states, words have a way of saying things which are not at all what you want them to say. There's a machine there, a text machine, an implacable determination, a total arbitrariness which inhabits words on the level of the play of the signifier, which undoes any narrative consistency of lines, and which undoes the reflexive and dialectical model, both of which are, as you know, the basis of any narration. De Man's tendency to take the usury, or particular isn't a word yet, play, as license for claims at the level of the any and always or universal is one reason, I think, that his vein of deconstruction, or perhaps of the Yale School of Rhetorical Reading, can, for all of its moments of play, sometimes feel to us played out, undone by its endless undoing, whereas we might say less generously that this mode of rhetorical reading might feel all used up. Usure. Thus, where Edelman follows de Man and Lacan in assigning an inevitability to the figure relations in which social identities are always inscribed, I think we might turn to the figure of the wearing down or rubbing away or the use of inscription to kind of counter this idea of inevitability. That is what might offer us a passage back to Derrida's exurge, away from the usury and universals as de Man and Lacan, and back to a general economy that is not a universalization of a particular language, that might return to a dialectic or reflexive dialogue with the specific economies of the speculative future. So, to kind of move from this basic edge back up to speculative and the general economy. Okay. So, this is why the turn to exurge in Derrida's white mythology. So Derrida's white mythology asks whether it is ever possible for the text of philosophical thought to be truly literal. That is, whether thought can ever be free from the figurations of metaphors of language. In his exurge, he turns to an example from Anatole France's 1894 text, The Garden of Epicurus. He begins, "Let us take all the risk of unearthing an example of this metaphor, of the usure of metaphor, the ruining of the figure in the Garden of Epicurus. As the exurge to this chapter, let us remark the metaphor borrowed from Anatole France, the philosophical usure of this figure, also by chance, which describes the active erosion of an exurge." So Derrida sets the scene of this dialogue of Aristos and Polyphilos, who are speaking about the language of metaphysics in a scene that dramatizes both sense of usure, that is, as erasure by rubbing, exhaustion, and crumbling away, but also as a supplementary production of capital, that is, the exchange which, far from losing an original investment, fructifies or increases, multiplies initial wealth, and increases its return in the form of revenue, additional interest, or linguistic surplus value. Here's the first part of the dialogue by Polyphilos. "I was thinking how the metaphysicians, when they make a language for themselves, are like knife grinders, who instead of knives and scissors should put the metals and coins to the grindstone to efface the exurge, that is, the value and the head, the inscription on the coin. When they have worked away till nothing is visible in their crown pieces, neither King Edward, the Emperor William, nor the Republic, they say, these pieces have nothing either English, German, or French about them. We have freed them from all limits of time and space. They are not worth 5 shillings anymore. They are of an inestimable value, and their exchange value is extended indefinitely. They are right in speaking thus, but this needy knife grinder's activity, by this needy knife grinder's activity, words are changed from a physical to a metaphysical acceptation. It is obvious what they lose in the process. What they gain by it is not so immediately apparent." This dialogue continues when Polyphilos proposes restoring the primitive original physical senses to figurative abstractions of philosophy. Thus, the phrase, "the spirit possesses God," would be translated as, "he whose breath is a sign of life will find a place in the divine fire, source and home of life." Polyphilos comments that this phrase has, quote, "acquired the ring of some fragment of a Vedic hymn and smacks of ancient Oriental mythology. And accordingly, quote, we have found symbols in a myth in a sentence that was essentially symbolic and mythical." Polyphilos concludes, "I think I have made you realize one thing, Aristos, that any expression of an abstract idea can only be an analogy. By an odd fate, the very metaphysicians who think to escape the world of appearances are constrained to live perpetually in allegory. A sorry lot of poets, they dim the colors of the ancient fables and are themselves but gatherers of fables. They produce white mythology." Derrida's gloss on the phrase white mythology, white as in blank or anemically pale, is devastating. He writes, A formula, brief, condensed, economical, almost mute, has been deployed, with the derisive effect always produced by the prolix and gesticulating translation of an Oriental ideogram. Parody of the translator, naivete of the metaphysical, or the perpetual peripatetic who does not recognize his own figure and does not know where it has marched him to. Metaphysics, the white mythology which reassembles and reflects the culture of the West. The white man takes his own mythology, Indo-European mythology, his own logos, that is the mythos of his idiom, for the universal form of what he might still wish to call reason. As kind of a nasty aside here, I have always kind of wondered if, following the example of W.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, we might productively use the term white deconstruction to describe those later uses of Derrida, which have miraculously effaced all mention of the white man or race in general from accounts of deconstruction. And in any event, it is through his reading of Usure and Exurg, or of inscription on coinage, that Derrida finds a scene of exchange between language and money, or the linguistic and the economic. He observes that Marx, in the contribution to the critique of political economy, quote, organizes into the system the motifs of usure of coinage speaking different languages, that is, doing something against its nature. Coin should not speak in languages. And he connects this observation about the exchange between language and money to a key passage in Saussure's course on general linguistics. So this is kind of what I mean by putting Derrida here as a mode for shuttling between the general linguistics of Saussure and Marx's account of usure and capital, and a contribution to the critique of political economy. So in the passage that Derrida quotes on Saussure, Saussure is meditating on the relationship between signification and value. Oops, skip these, sorry. The relationship between signification and value through the example of a 5-franc piece. So, quote, to resolve the issue of the relation of signification to value, let us observe from the outset that even outside language, all values are apparently governed by the same paradoxical principle. They are always composed, first, of a dissimilar thing that can be exchanged for the thing of which the value is to be determined, and two, of similar things that can be compared with the thing of which the value is determined. So Saussure concludes that both factors are necessary for the existence of value. To determine what a 5-franc piece is worth, one must know what it can be exchanged with, and that it can be first exchanged for a fixed quantity of a different thing, for instance, bread, or second, compared with a similar value of the same system, for instance, 5 1-franc pieces. In the same way, a word can be exchanged for something dissimilar, that is, a thought or an idea, and it can also be, quote, compared with something of the same nature, that is, another word. Derrida draws from Saussure here the idea that value, gold, the eye, the sun, etc., are all carried along, has long been known, in the same forms of tropic or figural movement. Their exchange dominates the field of rhetoric and of philosophy in a kind of indissoluble manner. Saussure's remark reminds us that most nature, the most natural, the most universal, most real, most luminous thing, the apparently most exterior referent, that is the sun, do not completely escape the general law of metaphoric value as soon as it intervenes and in the process of semantic value. The value of just any term is accordingly determined by its environment. It is impossible to fix the value of the signifier sun without considering its surroundings. In some languages, it is not possible to sit in the sun. I think we can draw from this a kind of powerful idea that even the sun has a setting that is determined by its environment, and that in some ways that we might think about the problem of setting, of temporality, of contextualization, and maybe even of history through Derrida's writing on the exurg or figuration in a way that doesn't fall into the common trap of thinking about Derrida as only, for some reason, talking about language or text. So I will work out the connection of Marx and his understanding of money and the commodity in a moment, but before doing so, I just want to spend a moment with two of the exurgs, or epigraphs, of Munoz and Edelman's texts. Here they are. Munoz's epigraph: a map of the world that does not include utopia is not worth glancing at. Edelman, second epigraph: yes, I was thinking we live without a future. That's what's queer. Virginia Woolf. We might note that the exurgs of both of these texts on the future of queer theory could be reread as literally as one might wish, or might be possible, as Usures of Modernist forms. That is, if one stipulates that Wilde and Woolf are both modernist writers, Munoz places a period where Wilde has placed a comma, and Edelman has placed an ellipsis where wolf is placed a colon, both forms of usures on the exurg. Here's the full kinds of quotations that we might provide with the rubbings out removed. A map of the world that does not include utopia is not even glancing at, for it leaves out the one country at which humanity is always landing. And when humanity lands there, it looks out and seeing a better country sets sail. Progress is the realization of utopias. Linear narrative, if there ever was one. And then Edelman. Yes, I was thinking we live without a future. That's what's queer, with our noses pressed to a closed door. So here I want to think about what happens when these figurations disappear or rubbed out, what's happening in the users of these modernist writers' texts. And I think that something that we can draw out from here is something happening at the level of the speculative, that is the work of the eye at the horizon. Note that instead of the glance, what continues as the rationale for the map of the world that does not include utopia not being even worth glancing at is that one must look out and see ahead of oneself the humanity where one always lands. There's a kind of affirmative account or nostalgia, even if Wilde's politics might have been wildly different from that, from a kind of maritime idea of expansion or constant movement, that one can constantly find new frontiers or new worlds in which to map out the space of utopia. Similarly, we can find in Woolf's diary entry of January 26, 1941, a couple months before her suicide, a sense of closure upon this idea of the opening of the door. Note that it's not a wall, not a complete ending of the possibility of forward movement, but the sense that what might once have been an open door is now closed. Now, something else that's eliminated in the process of creating epigraphs out of these modernist texts through a process of Usure in both Munoz and Edelman is an elimination of historical dates, that is 1891 and 1941. And I think that we might productively think about what might happen if we return to a sense on why there might be, for instance, an idea of the sun setting on empire, or the idea of there being a closure of the frontiers of British expansionist mercantilism. Hence, Marxism. And particularly Arrighi's take through the long 20th century. If we start thinking about 1891 and 1941, a 50-year period within the broader kind of senses of the long centuries mapped out by Arrighi in his book, The Long 20th Century, we maybe can think about Woolf and Wilde as being situated, let's see, where are we in this kind of map here? Okay, 1890 is kind of here at the end of the long 19th century after a signal crisis that marks a kind of expansion of gentlemanly capitalism or financial capital with the center of British Empire. And Wilde is writing, Woolf is writing after the kind of terminal crisis of British-centered long 19th century or empire in the 1940s. Now, why might this be a kind of move that we might risk making, thinking about queerness in long century terms? I think one way that we can do this is by returning to Marx's general formula in Capital, that is money in its liquid form moving into solid commodities in a kind of fixed form, and then moving into surplus value money through a systemic cycle of accumulation. So Arrighi maps this out as follows. Money, capital, M means liquidity, flexibility, and freedom of choice. Commodity capital, C means capital invested in a particular input-output combination, means concreteness, rigidity, and narrowing down or closing of options. And M prime means expanded liquidity, flexibility, and freedom of choice. Now, Arrighi's innovation is to shift this general formula. Sorry, I should write this down. Of MCM prime into a larger scale than individual capitalist investments. Reading it as also a recurrent pattern of historical capitalism as a world system. The central aspect of this pattern is the alternation of epochs of material expansion, that is from M to C, with phases of financial rebirth and expansion from C to M prime. In phases of material expansion, money capital sets in motion an increasing mass of commodities, and in phases of financial expansion, an increasing mass of money capital sets itself free from its commodity form, and accumulation proceeds through financial deals. Together, these two epochs constitute a full systemic cycle of accumulation. So to work through what this looks like, again in the Origi map, the long 19th century figures as a moment in which material investments in production, say, of factories within England occurs through this kind of middle period here. A signal crisis associated with the Panic of 1873 leads to a kind of shift into gentleman capitalism, and an increasing movement into financial and speculative capitalism collapses in, say, 1929 or 1930 with the end of the long 19th century. Now, one thing that this, I think, might help us do is to try to connect a movement back to thinking about the usures of modernist form to our present moment of financial and speculative capital. That is, for those of you that are studying the long 19th century or are either in art history or in literary studies, or trying to think about ways to justify one's practice of thinking about British Empire, what does this have to do with the present? I think one compelling case is to have ready to hand an understanding of a long 20th century framework so that one can make the claim that your studying of speculative and financial capital environments of, say, 1870 to 1930 may in some way bear upon or be reflected or echo in our present moment of speculative financial capitalization. Also, if you're an early modernist, you might turn to Will Fisher's Queer Money article, and this is my pivot from thinking from usury to counterfeiting and the kind of latter third of my talk, where I'll talk about my own work. It's interesting to think about counterfeiting and usury as repeatedly figured as unnatural sexual practices. So Fisher's argument here in turning to 16th and 17th century early modern English texts is to draw an etymology of queer, which is not associated with queer as backward or awkward or not straight or rather bent, but to think about queer and its connection etymologically to counterfeit. That is, holdover of this is now a somewhat archaic phrase of queer money to indicate counterfeit money, or queer as a $3 bill to indicate something kind of off or fake. So both counterfeiting and usury repeatedly figured as unnatural sexual practices. The discourses about these two different types of illicit monetary activity were figuratively conflated in early modern Europe as illegitimate means of generating money, counterfeiting by making false coins, usury by making money breed, both somehow unnatural modes of the production of things that should not by nature reproduce. This takes us to the end of the long 15th, 16th century, or maybe even the end of the long 17th century if you want to go back there. So I found these kinds of ways of thinking helpful for my own work on trying to figure out what's going on with, say, the period that Susan mentioned in her introduction to my work, which is roughly between 1885 to 1924, kind of solidly within the speculative financial capitalization moment, which also marks the heyday of a kind of first wave of Japanese emigration into the United States, and the kinds of figures that appear there. And so one key figure for my thinking about this is the poet Yone Noguchi, born 1875 to 1947, a kind of quick biographical sketch that places him in California between 1893 and 1900. And it's quite interesting, I think, to read his work in the context of these kinds of questions about gold, counterfeit, and the question of the fake and the real. So for those of you that are more invested within Asian American studies, say, to actually kind of double down on the claim that Noguchi presents a kind of fake Asian Americanness, and to associate the fake and the queer much more closely in this case. I'm here talking about Frank Chin and other IE collective writers who indict Sadakichi Hartman and Yone Noguchi as somehow representing the fake as opposed to the real, exemplified by later figures like John Okada, et cetera. Okay, so in 1897, he's accused of plagiarism in his collection Seen and Unseen, of essentially being a fake artist or a copyist who takes lines out of Poe's poetry and reclips them into his own. And in coming to his defense, the editor of Seen and Unseen, the first collection of Yone Noguchi's poems, writes, "We gave him but the cruel metal of the crude metal of the language, and he has returned to us minted into gold coin." And I think for the purposes of working through a kind of alternate account of the predecessors to modernist forum as exemplified through the work of Ezra Pound and most kind of standard literary historical accounts, we can find a kind of foretaste of this in an arc between 1897 and 1904. There's 1897, in which Noguchi writes a song unto Brother Americans, which focuses on the Klondike gold discovery and gold standard debates. We might contextualize this with William Jennings Bryan, 1896, Crux of Gold, to the 1900 election contest as well, over the gold standard debates, etc. And then its kind of movement into formal terms in a proposal to American poets, Hokku of 1904. A kind of movement, I think, from the question of species to broader questions of poetic form. So in Noguchi's song unto Brother Americans, here appended to a love letter to my dear Charlie Stoddard, Noguchi works through a kind of way of thinking about, let's see, thou mortal divorced husband from Lady Repose, life sold, money slave to time, thou ant battling for gold dew, art a demon child unlike the father god. Gather mortal the boundless gold that bids not advance adieu, the world-fulfilling gold that kindles mortal's delight, O gold, not the Klondike gold, the gold at the proud gate of the San Francisco Bay, I, the divine gold of the majestic sun. Here, an attempt to convert the metal gold in which California is famous to thinking about a poetic or linguistic conversion of material species into a horizon which ends up being a way in which perhaps a Japanese subject might be positioned as a brother to Americans. That is, in the final two lines, hark, an awakening shout, Klondike gold, nay mortal the gold of day, I, the emperor's son, glorifies the snow-robed Alaska land with a crown of golden light. Here, working on, let's go back to Derrida on Usure, a kind of very standard set of master tropes about value, gold, the eye, the sun, and the horizon carried through in this kind of tropic moment. With this kind of account of gold to horizon movement through Noguchi's song unto Brother Americans, I think we can shift into thinking about Noguchi's work and preludes for thinking about the problem of poetic form. So in a proposal to American poets published in The Reader in 1904, predating, say, In a Station Metro by Pound by about 10 years, he makes the following proposal. Hokku, a 17-syllable poem, is like a tiny star, mind you, carrying the whole sky at its back. It is like a slightly open door where you may steal into the realm of poesy. It is simply a guiding lamp. Its value depends on how much it suggests. The Hokku poet's chief aim is to impress the reader with a high atmosphere in which he is living. I always compare an English poem with a mansion with windows widely open, even the pictures of its drawing room being visible from outside. I dare say it does not tempt me much to see it within. And here, again, I think we might read this in a kind of weird, productive dialogue with the queerly closed door of Wilde's 1941 diary entry, right? That by 1904, and I don't want to make too much of this, there's already a sense that the moment of encounter between Japan and the United States, or Japan and England, is already starting to close. We can think about the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905, rising Yellow Peril fears, and then the Gentlemen's Act of 1907, a kind of mutual diplomatic agreement about restriction, as in some way maybe having some effect. I don't want to say a wholly deterministic effect, but at least one that might suggest a structure of feeling about why Hokku is a slightly open door might be the kind of conversion that happens to the gold standard poetry that Noguchi introduces in 1897. Now, as a kind of final treat or entreaty or invitation, I want to turn to a kind of more local text, that is Chicago 1900, which I think is a crucial kind of transitional text that was written while Noguchi was in town for the Republican Convention of 1900. Again, an election in which the gold standard and the question of value, as well as the Boer War, the Boxer Rebellion, other kinds of world-spanning events are all present in a text that might otherwise seem to be quite trivial. So Chicago 1900 is first glossed as the poet on Mantown, Chicago in June 2nd, 1900. And this is a text that I'm still working on and have turned to Munoz and Edelman in order to try to think about. So in the passage that I'm about to read, I've been trying to think about this as risking something like what Jose Munoz is reading in his chapter on Samuel Delaney's Memoirs of Times Square of the 60s and 70s public, the risks, the problems, and the failures, but also the potential joys and utopian glimpses that we can get through an understanding of interclass and interracial contexts and sexualities in a broader and expanded sense of public space within that chapter. I also want to think about this as something that occurs before, say, the no future in the specific context of Japanese American immigration thought of through the Immigration Acts of 1917 and 1924. Now, for Lacanians in the room who might be in Asian American studies, I've always kind of wanted to read a reading of the Asiatic Barred Zone Act, otherwise known as the Literacy Act. This seems like it would be available for anybody that wants to talk about literature or the barred subject through a literal law. You know, that might be fun to do. I haven't been able to do it, but that might be something to think about. But to think about both of these might be something that we can do when we're thinking about the following passage through Chicago. So in Chicago, Noguchi writes, "Glad am I to have acquaintance with a few Negro gentlemen. Is there any reason why they cannot be gentlemen being waiters? What are their names? Who knows?" With potential resonances to the question of anonymity in Delaney. "Seeing me every morning with they cordially welcome me with silent large smiles, showing me their white teeth, sparkling their somewhat yellow eyes. Their graceful manner and gentility soon make me forget anything unagreeable about them and bring me to a fairy world of sweetness and satisfaction. I cannot be happy unless waited on by some black face. I recall what a jolly face they make when they find a 2 bits, that is a quarter, under the plate. Oh, happy Negro gentleman waiter, I love you, I will be with you forever. One morning I paid for my breakfast with a $5 piece of gold. Do you know that in California only the gold is acceptable money? Such a solid green piece of paper ought to go into the wastebasket. Paper money? What a value is in it anyhow? How can I distinguish a counterfeit from the real money? You say there is no counterfeit in Chicago? That's not money. Take it away. Destroy it, I say, when the black waiter, such a jolly gentleman Negro, gave me a dirty green paper as a change for my gold piece. He laughed, showing his ivory teeth like a gentle bear, and said with lovely excitement, You are all right. Throw it away if you wish, but I will pick it up and keep it myself. Ha, ha, ha. He laughed like thundering. Now, it's possible to read this scene as just a series of jokes playing upon the gold standards and greenback currency debates active within the 1890s up to the 1900s, and to read this within a kind of mode of encounter in which greenbacks, that is paper currency, here I'm drawing an image from O'Malley's Face Value, an interesting reading of the association and entwinement of discourses of money and race through American history. Here is a kind of playbill from a minstrelsy show, How Are You Greenbacks, in which blackface and the greenback associated with the payment of black Union soldiers represents a kind of inflation of value of the greenback, worthless paper, which parallels the inflated value of the freed slave, also presumed to be a worthless human being. We can also see this discourse of gold animated in the race and silver and gold figurations. The comic at the left is an example of which the kind of worthwhile tradesmen in the front, represented as America, England, and Germany, have acquired a gold standard and thus avoid this snake oil of Minower's silver elixir endorsed by the brown and yellow nations of India, Japan, China, and Mexico, who are on silver currencies. Here we can see racist characterizations of countries on the silver standard who run into the buzzsaw of the Anglo-American gold standard or free coinage of the valuable dollar. So with this kind of racial discourse in mind and its figuration into money, we now have a figuration into linguistic or maybe even poetic form. Even a soiled paper is worth something, no doubt, in America, but the trouble is to keep such a paper makes a pocket awfully wet. You not keep it, spend it, you say. All right, my dear sir, Chicago makes that easy, if not pleasant. O Negroes, you good-natured, never-getting sad creatures, am all ready any day to leave this stone-hearted, smoky-faced city of Chicago and join with you to your native land. You have no home, you say. You imported as a slave many a year ago, you say. Slave, what a sadly sweet submitting, what a gently melancholy obedience the word slave expresses. You were perfectly fortunate that you were a slave. The people who kept you a slave were greatly mistaken. I can still see some stains of slavery in your face. I can recognize the traces of nobility in the face of a bridge beggar who was once a noble man. Surely you have had a sad experience. Okay, this passage is obviously and profoundly deeply problematic. It involves a conversion of slavery as material bodies and historical memory into poetic language and figuration. Notice the way that slave is converted from a person into a word. That is, slave, what a sadly sweet submitting, what a gently melancholic obedience the word slave expresses. Notice also the proliferation of rhetorical figures, the presence of face that attaches both to the singular and the plural. That is, here, the stone-hearted, smoky-faced city of Chicago, and then I still see some stains of slavery in your face, addressing the face of all Negroes. This kind of odd slippage between the singular and plural. So obvious problems with this kind of conversion, and something to think about when we think carefully through this problem of figuration, whether or not there's some modes of figuration or the figurative that we might not be on board with, the kind of dangers that occur within these modes of poetic shift into language or into money. At the same time, however, and I think that this is the risk that engaging with Noguchi and the users of these kinds of preludes to modernist form might provide, is that there's something, I think, like a Delanian utopian horizon to be found in this moment. A desire to return, a desire for some kind of unity, and maybe even a declaration of love that brings us into the zone of something like Samuel Delany's Tales of Neverion, which also work through this kind of problematic zone of racial encounter through shifts of a money economy and a credit economy. So I think, I'm not quite sure what to say about this. I'm still working through these modes, but I at least think that this might help explain why I've been trying to work through a kind of figuration of Munoz and Edelman that also expands out to think about what the historical or world configurations of these might be in terms of a broader sense of monetary economy. So by way of conclusion, here is kind of Noguchi's flippant remark that Chicago is the city of no time to spare for another. Chicago is the city of time as money. Chicago never invites any lazy guest. Chicago has no patience for the people asking questions, moving uncertainly. But I'd just say that I have much patience for moving uncertainly, and I certainly have the patience to hopefully address your questions.